South Africa's debt is through the roof. It stands to increase from 4.3 trillion to 5.4 trillion rand over the medium term. Because of this, the finance minister says in his budget they're reducing the fiscal deficit and stabilizing their debt. But years of state capture have seen Eskom's massive debt bill ballooning to just shy of 400 billion rand. Now, this budget says you and I will be forking out more of our hard-earned taxes to pay off that account. In fact, more than 300 billion rand is set aside for bailing out failed state-owned companies. We've invited University of Johannesburg Professor of Business and Economics, Miriam Altman, to discuss this with us. Professor, thank you so much for your time. When it comes to SOEs, I think the two words that people will remember from the speech yesterday is tough love. And some people feel that it really should have been just tough and no love. So what exactly does the minister mean by tough love?
Well, it's got to be love. So tough love is a perfect way of thinking about it. What it means is we have to love these SOEs. They play a critical role, but probably a different kind of role, and they have to be shown the way to better performance, for sure. Having said that, so what he's saying basically is that every single year, this way of thinking is introduced in the budget, and then money is given to the SOEs. This year, he's saying, we're not going to do that. We're going to be issuing a new policy approach to approving SOE funding. And that's the end of just passing money on. You guys have to sell assets or do whatever you need to do, but we've got to start changing the way we do things.
All right, let's talk about changing the way we do things. When you talk about SOEs, the conversation normally revolves around privatization versus the government having control. Is there some kind of middle ground away from those two extremes where we can build dynamic businesses that will be able to thrive?
Well, you just stole my words, huh? That's exactly what we have to do. The problem is we end up in this ideological privatized versus state delivery, whether you love it or you hate it. This model's just not working for us. And the most important thing is not whether it's delivered by the state or the private market, but what is the best way of delivering public goods. And it is no longer uniquely by a state monopoly, which was the original model maybe 40, 50 years ago. Now there's new technology, there's new modes of delivery. What we have to do is we have to probably shrink these entities down to the essence of where the state really does need to play a role, because the state does play an important role, strengthen the role of the regulators, introduce more competition where that is logical and makes sense, and have an ecosystem that gets us to a better mode of delivery. That's where we have to go, because the model we're in now isn't working. I'm not sure it's working in any location anymore in South Africa.
What has history taught us about privatization, Prof? And I know you were part of Telkom for a while, so maybe you could tell us some of the lessons there. And what kind of leadership do we need to bring about the change that you've just described?
Well, Telkom's a perfect example. I was chief of strategy. I was working there, bringing together the turnaround for the board and for the CEO. Telkom's a perfect example of how quickly an SOE can be turned around that seems to be failing and was failing. We did it within 3 years and even less through good governance principles. But the reality was that probably the way that Telkom was commercialized was maybe not quite the right way. What we have to remember is, firstly, that to privatize, you actually need a strong state. A lot of people don't realize that. But if you think about it, the private sector can't privatize a public service. The public sector has to do that. The public sector has to regulate and protect the public interest. So we have to have a minimum capability in the state, technical, in terms of leadership, in terms of governance, in terms of accountability. That may sound abstract, but that was actually, in my view, the main ingredient and main contributor to why Telkom turned around. It was the appointment of an independent and very strong board, the appointment of a very strong CEO. They lasted in their positions for a period of time. We didn't deal with political interference, and we were able to turn the company around. That is a very critical difference to what's happening right now in most of the infrastructure SOEs that currently I'm engaged with.
Are there examples of anywhere where this might work or is starting to work in South Africa?
Well, Telkom's a good example. In 2013, I joined. Sipho Maseko joined, and I joined him at the same time. And a completely failing and hated company. You know, it's not perfect, but it's going from strength to strength every year through some basic principles around governance, around performance management. It was very simple principles that we adopted that any SOE could. And remember, we were in a competitive market. You know, Eskom doesn't faces huge pressures, but it doesn't face the problem of also dealing with competition at the same time. So that, I think Telkom was a very good example. What we're also seeing now in energy is at Eskom having Andre de Ruyter there as a very strong CEO, turning around an executive management team, getting, you know, the new amendment to the Electricity Regulation Act that would introduce multi-markets and creates the regulations to establish the transmission company and its functions, will introduce competition into the market. And he, as a CEO, is driving that very hard. That's the first time that we've had that experience. Now what has to happen around Eskom is that their board expired in March 2021, and we need to now see a strong board. We need to see the same thing, management and board at PRASA. You know, at all the SOEs, we need to start seeing the same kind of movement that we saw at Telkom, which, in my view, leadership is the key question, and then we need to have much more discussion about performance, human resource management, and enabling these entities to be given clear instruction about what is required of them, and then letting them do it.
Prof, you've said that, you know, the state monopolies are just not working anywhere, really. So why is there still so much resistance to making the changes that you're speaking about?
This kind of change is a very hard one to affect. Let's not underestimate the vested interests. You know, there's a lot of ideology tied up in it. There may be a lack of trust of the private sector in some quarters. There may just be a lack of capability in some quarters because it hasn't been brought in the way it needs to be. But don't underestimate how difficult it is to make this kind of transition from state delivery to one that involves a multi-market kind of ecosystem kind of approach of delivery. It is not a small set of steps.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. The University of Johannesburg's Professor of Business and Economics, Miriam Altman, joining us on NewsLink.